This is NTD Evening News. Live from our NTD Global Headquarters in New York City, here is Tiffany Meyer.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. First, we start with some breaking news. A coup appears to be underway in Bolivia. Armed forces took over the capital's central square this afternoon. An armored vehicle rammed through the entrance to the presidential palace, followed by soldiers rushing in. The president commanded the forces to withdraw. A top general said on local TV, the three chiefs of the armed forces have come to express our dismay. There will be a new cabinet of ministers. Surely things will change. Bolivia's president has split with the head of the ruling Socialist Party, while the former conservative president is in jail. Both rivals have condemned the coup. The Supreme Court today ruled that it was wrong for a lower court to block the Biden administration from communicating with social media platforms. The decision undercuts the complaints of two Republican-led states that argued First Amendment rights were violated when the federal government collaborated with platforms to remove unwanted content. Our legal correspondent Arlene Richards has the details.
In a 6-3 decision on Wednesday, the Supreme Court preserved the federal government's ability to communicate with social media platforms, which means the government can continue to encourage platforms to take steps to block what they believe to be misinformation. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, writing the opinion for the court, said the plaintiffs, two Republican-led states and 5 individuals, didn't prove they had standing to seek an injunction against the government. She said they didn't prove they had any direct injury based on the government's involvement in advising platforms on what content to regulate, saying the plaintiffs should have sued the platforms themselves. Barrett wrote, "Here, the plaintiffs' theories of standing depend on the platform's actions, yet the plaintiffs do not seek to enjoin the platforms from restricting any posts or accounts." She also said the plaintiffs had not shown that they would face immediate significant harm due to the government's actions. The case stems from a period during the 2020 election and the COVID-19 pandemic when individuals posted their opinions on social media platforms. Platforms often removed posts they deemed to be false or misleading information. At the same time, several government officials communicated extensively with the platforms. Justice Samuel Alito, joined by Justices Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch, wrote in a dissenting opinion that this is one of the most important free speech cases to reach this court in years. He said under the First Amendment, government officials may not coerce private entities to suppress speech. And that is what happened in this case, he wrote. He said the record contained vast evidence of communications between government actors and platforms that impacted the plaintiffs. The case is now pushed back to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals for further proceedings based on the majority decision. Arlene Richards, NTD News.
The Supreme Court may be denying the state of Idaho's request for emergency relief in a state abortion case. That's according to an unverified opinion published by Bloomberg, which reports that the document appeared briefly on the Supreme Court website. If the opinion is published by the end of this week, Idaho's law against abortions will stay on ice until the Court of Appeals makes a final decision. The state's law bans most abortions except in life-threatening situations. Both lower courts temporarily blocked the ban after the federal government sued the state under the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, saying state law can't bar hospitals from treating patients in emergency situations. The Supreme Court seems poised to reject the state's request for an emergency review, which means the law will be blocked until after the case is fully litigated in the lower court. The High Court is due to issue rulings on Thursday and Friday as it reaches the end of its current term. The campaigns of President Biden and former President Trump previewing their strategies as they enter the final countdown to the first presidential debate. This comes as speculations rise amid a looming VP announcement from Trump. NTD's Iris Tao has more from the White House.
We're now less than 30 hours away from a historic debate that could steer the direction of the 2024 elections.
With CNN on Wednesday unveiling the debate stage, the Biden campaign sent out a new memo previewing the president's strategies of going after Trump on abortion, the economy, the border, Social Security and Medicare, Trump's claims about the 2020 election, and foreign policy. Biden's campaign also sent surrogates to Atlanta to take aim at Trump.
I've been very impressed that the Biden campaign has recognized that there are gettable Republicans out there.
In 10 years, you'll be hard-pressed to find a Republican that even admits they voted for Donald Trump.
Trump's team also sent out a memo on Wednesday saying they expect President Biden to attack Trump over his conviction over and over again. In turn, the Trump campaign says their focus will be on the border and inflation.
Meanwhile, Trump last night said this about the debate.
I think I've been preparing for it for my whole life. We've done well in the past, and I think we'll do very well. I know the subject.
Biden's camp also announced a rapid response strategy in which they plan to quickly respond to Trump's comments during and after the debate, citing the need for fact-checking. But Trump fired back on Wednesday, accusing the other side of spreading falsehoods. In addition to the showdown itself tomorrow, another thing we're watching for is a looming Trump VP announcement.
Trump's team now says that could come as early as this week, and Trump has said before that his pick will be there at the debate. Reporting from the White House, Iris Tao, NTD News.
And about 6 in 10 U.S. adults plan to watch some element of tomorrow night's debate, and many think the event will be important for both candidates' campaigns. That's according to a new poll from the Associated Press and the Norwick Center for Public Affairs Research. The poll suggests tens of millions of Americans are likely to see or hear about at least part of the debate, despite how unusually early it comes in the campaign season. On that note, be sure to join Steve Lance and myself for analysis of the first debate. Watch the first half of The Nation Decides at 8:30 p.m. Eastern and our second half after the debate at 11 p.m. Eastern. That's tomorrow night. Don't miss it. A top Democratic lawyer is trying to keep Robert F. Kennedy Jr. off New Jersey's ballot this November. Scott Salmon claims Kennedy broke the state's so-called sore loser law. The law stops candidates from running as independents after losing a major party nomination. Kennedy initially ran for president as a Democrat until October 2023. Salmon has challenged other candidates before, including Kanye West in 2020. He says Kennedy's actions violate the law and wants him barred from the ballot. Kennedy's team has not commented yet. Homeland Security says illegal border crossings are dropping quickly. They are at the lowest point since President Biden took office. NTD's international correspondent Arian Pasdar has the immigration update.
Homeland Security says since President Biden took executive immigration action, the number of illegal border crossings has gone down by over 40%. Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas commented on this drop on Wednesday, crediting Biden for the low numbers.
The president's actions are working because of their tough response to illegal crossings and because they built on our sustained effort to exercise our full authorities.
According to the new numbers, average daily arrests are now below 2,400, but that's still above the 1,500 mark needed to continue asylum processing. Under Biden's executive action, asylum claims will not be processed if daily arrests are too high. Some exceptions are fear of torture and persecution in the migrant's home country. Mayorkas gave Wednesday's remarks in Tucson, Arizona. He says a bipartisan immigration bill, which failed to advance in the Senate earlier this year, would have added much-needed personnel to the border.
We are continuing to call on Congress to provide the resources we need to support our men and women on the front lines of our border.
Meanwhile, in Florida, a group of more than 100 migrants from Haiti arrived in a sailboat on Wednesday morning. The boat arrived close to the Florida Keys. Authorities say most of the 118 immigrants are male, but the group also includes women and children. And NBC reports that Homeland Security identified over 400 immigrants who came to the U.S. using a smuggling group linked to ISIS. More than 150 of them have been arrested, but the location of over 50 others is unknown. Lastly, Border Patrol agents are calling on migrants to reconsider making the journey to the U.S. because of extreme heat and the rough terrain.
The loss of life is not worth making this trek because all of these smuggling organizations are lying to the migrants who are crossing because to them, they're just a commodity.
The agent suggested that the reality migrants encounter on the journey can be very different from what they expected. Arian Pasdar, NTD News.
Killed for their beliefs. It's a problem happening in several countries across the globe, but none worse than inside communist China. Today, the State Department released its annual International Religious Freedom Report. NTD's Washington correspondent Jack Bradley has the details.
This report analyzes religious freedom in nearly 200 countries across the globe. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, when announcing this report on Wednesday, spoke to a group of persecuted individuals from across the globe. One of them is a practitioner of Falun Gong, a spiritual practice based on truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance, and consists of meditative exercises.
This year marks the 25th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party's crackdown on Falun Gong practitioners. Joining us today is Yu Sheng, a courageous leader who has served several prison sentences, at times enduring torture for her beliefs, and who eagerly seeks to be reunited with her husband, who is still imprisoned in China.
I was arrested. They sentenced me to the jail for 4 years, and sentenced me to the labor camp for 3 years and 6 months. They forced me to give up. For example, they didn't allow me to go to bed, and not allow me to sit down even.
As for her husband, who's currently in prison for practicing Falun Dafa,
I every day worry about his safety.
This comes a day after the House passed a bipartisan bill called the Falun Gong Protection Act, which would sanction any individual involved in the Chinese regime's forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners. And earlier this week, the State Department released the 2024 Trafficking in Persons report, which also cited concerns over China's forced organ harvesting.
For Falun Gong practitioners in China, is like a light. It's very, very helpful for them. Although CCP said that they don't care, as if they don't care about the U.S. government action or something, but indeed they are afraid. So I think U.S. government can do more, because the persecution lasts too long, 25 years.
This report will be used to influence policy decisions in the government going forward. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Jack Bradley, NTD News.
The China threat in the spotlight today. 2 House committees diving into the regime's ongoing efforts to subvert America economically and politically, with the ultimate goal of changing our way of life. NTD's Melina Weisskopf has details.
It's a criminal state, is what it is.
Every economic activity accrues to the party's benefit, and the party's goal is to upend our way of life and to dominate and change our way of life. I believe that these listing standards should be changed.
In a nutshell, this is what U.S. lawmakers are working to expose to the American people. Congress on Wednesday held 2 separate hearings to probe the Chinese Communist Party's global subversion, and witnesses say that the threats that China poses run deep in the business sector and beyond.
You can attack the United States diplomatically through science and culture and education, science and technology, data, space, trade, and it's all interconnected.
Congressman Michael Cloud tells NTD that China is taking advantage of our own policies to engage in unrestricted warfare.
You can think about the border, for example, just as one, how not only are they working to get fentanyl through, they're working to get a number of potentially their military into our country through the border apparatus they've set up.
As for militarily, China now dominates the shipbuilding industry, and its Navy has doubled in size, now far surpassing the U.S. Navy.
The gap between our number of ships and theirs is widening dramatically.
Congresswoman Ashley Hinson tells NTD that China's so-called green energy initiatives are counterproductive. But at the same time, America needs to close policy loopholes to allow manufacturers at home to thrive.
They are not truly embracing green technology if they're manufacturing all these things using dirty coal and dirty oil and slave labor, right? How China continually goes around all of the mechanisms we put in place to protect American manufacturing. And so that's where I think we need to do some more work.
The China issue is a bipartisan one. One witness stressing the importance of maintaining a united front in opposing the CCP because it aims to divide and conquer.
But it's essential to remember what China is trying to accomplish, the ends as well as the means, which are to amplify our divisions and to create political paralysis so that we squander our strengths so that our government cannot act to meet our challenges.
The lawmakers acknowledge the work done under both the Trump and Biden administrations with trade tariffs and otherwise, but they warn that the efforts still fall short and more work does need to be done in order to counter the CCP's efforts to subvert American values. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Melina Weisskopf, NTD News.
And this just in, the attempted military coup in Bolivia has failed. The president named a new army commander who ordered troops to stand down. The trial of Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich started today behind closed doors in a Russian court. The American journalist is accused of spying. Prosecutors accuse Gershkovich of gathering secret information on the orders of the CIA about a company that manufactures tanks for Russia's war in Ukraine. If convicted, he faces a sentence of up to 20 years. Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal, and the U.S. government all strongly reject the allegations. They say he was just doing his job as a reporter. The trial could last for several months. WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange touched down in Australia today for the first time in 12 years. That's after formally entering a guilty plea in a U.S. court in Saipan. In a plea deal, he's sentenced to time served since he already spent 62 months in a London prison. Assange pleaded guilty to conspiring unlawfully to obtain and disseminate classified information. It was one of the largest breaches of classified material in U.S. military history. Assange's lawyer and supporters say he never should have been locked up in the first place, but critics say he endangered lives. Here's State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller earlier today.
I do think it is important when we talk about Julian Assange to remind the world that the actions for which he was indicted and for which he has now pled guilty are actions that put the lives of our partners, our allies, and our diplomats at risk, especially those who work in dangerous places like Afghanistan and Iraq. This was some years ago now, almost 15 years ago, so I think the world has forgotten much of it. But if you recall, when WikiLeaks first disseminated and published State Department documents, State Department cables, they did so without redacting names. They just threw them out there for the world to see. And so the documents they published gave identifying information of individuals who were in contact with the State Department. That included opposition leaders, human rights activists around the world, whose positions were put in some danger because of their public disclosure. It also chilled the ability of American personnel to build relationships and have frank conversations with them.
Miller added that the State Department at the time had to scramble to get people out of danger ahead of the information's release. It's unclear what Assange's next moves will be after his return to Canberra. One last piece of international news. Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte is set to become the next NATO Secretary General. He will take over the position on October 1st when Jens Stoltenberg's 10-year tenure comes to an end. Rutte called the appointment a tremendous honor that he does not take lightly. The Secretary General chairs all of NATO's major committees. He is also the alliance's principal spokesperson and handles the organization's international staff. Stoltenberg welcomed Rutte's appointment, calling him a strong leader and a consensus builder. Democratic voters in New York's 16th district chose to oust progressive Congressman Jamal Bowman as the war in Gaza continues to divide the party. His opponent is former state legislator George Latimer. Latimer entered the contest with the support of Jewish leaders and the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. Earlier, we spoke with Democratic strategist and former New York State Senator David Carlucci about the primary results. David Carlucci, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Great to be with you.
Now, AOC won her primary, but fellow progressive squad member Jamal Bowman lost his race. George Latimer, who defeated Bowman, is known for his pro-Israel stance. How has the conflict in the Middle East become a divisive issue within the Democratic Party?
Well, it's become a very divisive issue, and I wouldn't say that it's engulfed the entire Democratic Party, but you do see particularly members of the squad, the most progressive members of the Democratic Party have been very concerned and asking for an immediate ceasefire. And I think the majority of the Democratic Party stands with Israel, is definitely concerned about what's going on in Gaza, but stands with President Biden in trying to broker peace in the region, and not just for a day, not just for a month, but long-standing peace. Not easy, but you do see the majority of Democrats standing with President Biden. And I think that was a big factor that played into the race with Bowman against Latimer in terms of sticking with the president and helping the president and not trying to attack him for the work he's doing.
Now, the Washington Post has called the Bowman-Latimer primary, quote, a contest that divided the candidates on race, class, and the Middle East conflict. Now, it was also the most expensive primary ever. What do these results tell us about the Democratic base?
Well, I think we could definitely hypothesize and take each of those points because there are some unprecedented things here, right? We have a district. It was a newly created district, not the exact same that Bowman had won in originally. $25 million in a congressional primary. I mean, it's almost hard to imagine how you spend that much money in a congressional primary. But I think the key factor here, and I think people really need to focus on this before taking too many tea leaves out of it, is that George Latimer was an incredible candidate. And that's how he won. Yes, the money helps. And yes, the biggest fact that Bowman really took a stance so strong against Israel and against President Biden, that just infuriated a district that is heavily Jewish and has a long record of supporting Israel. I think that was the major factor here, and one that I think political pundits will try to, take little points here and there. But the big factor, I think, is that quality of candidates matter. And you could spend millions of dollars. It doesn't matter. If your message doesn't resonate, I don't care how much money you spend. So they had a good message, a good candidate, and well-financed, and it worked.
Expanding on that, Bowman said in his concession speech that this race wasn't just about him or his district. He implied that the progressive movement will continue and that, quote, this will be a battle for our humanity and justice for the rest of our lives. What do you see as next for Bowman?
Well, I think Bowman definitely leaned in. He took the political risk, the calculus, that he was going to lean in to what was most serious threat for his political viability, and that was to lean in against Israel. And that is something that I think it bona fide him with the progressive movement. And that's what I've been saying to people. I say, look, Bowman has a lot of support. The problem is it's just not within the 16th congressional district. Of course, he had some support, and you saw that in the numbers. But I think Bowman will play a role on the national stage, trying to excite progressives and push his agenda forward. In the White House administration, doubtful. But I think from the outside, being a political force is something that we do have to recognize. And I think he does have those pockets of support around the country. And I think that's something that he's going to try to capitalize on and move his agenda forward, not as a congressional candidate, but probably helping candidates around the country.
Now, Latimer celebrated by highlighting the need for unity for the nation to move forward. How do you see the Democratic Party, perhaps the country more broadly, moving forward together and finding that common ground?
Well, I think this shows that it's about compromise, right? You have here a politician in George Latimer. I had the honor of serving with him in the New York State Senate. He came from a local city, town official to a county legislator, chair of the county legislature. He was an assemblyman, then served with me in the Senate, county executive. So he knows how to get the job done. And that was a distinct difference between Bowman and Latimer. Bowman was about, hey, we need to get these issues done now, and we need to yell and scream about them. And George Latimer, maybe a little less passionate, but more focused on pragmatism and how we get that done. So I think that this is actually going to be good for the Democratic Party in the long run, that we say, look, let's get back more to the center. Of course, we have a big tent, and we welcome that. But now in Congress, we really need people to roll up their sleeves, get the job done, and try to push past the gridlock that currently exists in Congress. And sometimes that means reaching across the aisle and talking to people and other members of Congress that you don't agree with philosophically, but you can try to find common ground. I think this sends the message that Democrats are interested in more about what unites us than what divides us.
David Carlucci, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Government-funded ratings firms are accused of political bias. These firms give ratings to businesses and news organizations and affect what children see and hear in school.
The House Committee on Small Business held a hearing on government funding ratings firms accused of political bias.
The committee uncovered a vast network of nonprofits, research groups, and other entities that receive government funding with the goal of stopping misinformation. As these groups attempt to define what is true, there are many voices and businesses whose reach is being reduced.
Congressman Roger Williams says these groups rate businesses, including media organizations. These ratings greatly affect how much business they get. Policy analyst Carrie Sheffield says these ratings can make or break a business.
40% of small and medium business publishers say that digital ad sales drive over half of their overall revenue. So this could be the death knell.
Government funding ratings firms such as NewsGuard and the Global Disinformation Index, or GDI, give ratings to news firms. Real Clear Politics' Benjamin Weingarten says they overwhelmingly give low ratings to conservative news firms.
Many maligned by NewsGuard and GDI report plummeting ad revenues, which GDI's executives have gloated about. Some say they've lost traffic.
NewsGuard has partnered with the American Federation of Teachers. Over 1 million teachers now have NewsGuard in their schools, influencing what students see and hear.
American children are going to get a left-wing or left-wing oriented diet of news content going forward to the extent the relationship persists, and what's called media literacy education increasingly gets mandated in states across the country.
Law professor Marianne Franks says the government is not censoring citizens by funding these ratings firms.
Providing information to businesses about other businesses is not censorship. Efforts to convince consumers, advertisers, and the public that certain content is false, is fraudulent, harmful, extremist, harassing, or exploitative is not censorship.
Franks says the government is free to speak on its own behalf and take sides on controversial matters.
Joining me now to discuss the High Court's decision in the social media free speech case is Mark Miller. He's a senior attorney at the Pacific Legal Foundation. Mark, thank you so much for joining us. Great to see you again. Now, to begin, how big of an impact will this ruling have?
Well, Tiffany, it's great to be with you. And in fact, the impact really will not be that great because the Supreme Court did what it often will do, going back decades, probably since to the beginning of the country's history, is that it will try to avoid deciding important issues that will have massive political ramifications if they can. And here, 6 of the justices agreed that they would sort of avoid this case and punt on this important free speech case rather than decide it on the merits. They just simply said the plaintiffs who sued were not actually injured when the Biden administration called Facebook and Twitter and maybe pressured Facebook and Twitter to take down certain posts.
Now, Justice Alito wrote in the dissenting opinion, quote, "This is one of the most important free speech cases to reach the court in years." What does this ruling mean for free speech?
So to be sure, Justice Alito was not happy, and Justice Gorsuch and Justice Thomas concurred in his dissent. They agreed with his dissent that the case should have been taken. Justice Alito said that he felt that at least one of the plaintiffs, Ms. Hines, was actually injured. Justice Barrett, for the majority, said no, she was already having her post removed by Facebook before the Biden administration called. So the case really, although it could have had an important free speech and First Amendment impact, because the court just simply said we're not going to address it on the merits, you really can't treat it as a free speech case. It's really more just a challenge to plaintiffs and organizations to make sure when they bring a case that they have the right injuries for the plaintiffs that they can sue.
Expanding on that, the majority of the Supreme Court found the plaintiffs in this case did not have standing when bringing it. What was their basis for that?
The basis for the plaintiffs is they felt they were injured. They felt there was plenty of evidence in this case to suggest that Biden administration officials, and the government admitted it, had called Facebook, had called Twitter, and asked them to take down certain posts. The question became what we call jawboning. Is it wrong for government officials to simply call and say, hey, we don't like this post? If the government's pressuring you, say, hey, if you don't take this down, we may punish you, then to be sure, that would be illegal. That would violate the First Amendment. But here, it was a little less clear. The government's just saying, we'd like you to take it down. Is there a threat being made there? The government said, no, that's not a threat. It's just a reasonable, what we call jawboning.
Now, Justice Amy Coney Barrett wrote in the opinion that, quote, to establish standing, the plaintiffs must demonstrate a substantial risk that in the near future they will suffer an injury that is traceable to a government defendant and redressable by the injunction they seek. Given that, who would have standing here?
Well, you'd have to have a plaintiff who actually can show that Facebook and Twitter or any social media company took direct action because the administration called. You can make that case, but what the justices did by punting on this one is it's going to be very tough to see a case like this in the near future. It will take perhaps years to see it again.
Mark Miller, Senior Attorney at Pacific Legal Foundation, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tiffany.
On the Hill today, Republicans and Democrats share concerns over competition with China, but differ on budget allocations to the Commerce Department. NTD's Washington correspondent Luis Martinez has more on this story.
The House Appropriations Committee unveiled this Wednesday the Commerce, Justice, and Science Appropriations Bill for fiscal year 2025. The Commerce Department is set to see a 9% cut to its budget.
The Republicans have suggested that in the light of all the success, that they actually want to diminish your budget. We really can't afford to do that, especially since they're asking you to do more and more and more.
Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo urged lawmakers in the House Commerce and Energy Committee to greenlight the White House's budget request for the Commerce Department for fiscal year 2025.
This budget positions America to prevent China and other countries from obtaining U.S. technology, U.S. capital, and expertise for activities that threaten our national security. We have to beat China. That requires a strategy, and that requires investment.
Secretary Raimondo stressed that competition with China is one of the top priorities of the Department of Commerce, and not just because of economic reasons, but also because of national security requirements.
We need to outcompete China. Wake up every day asking ourselves, how do we outcompete China? I literally shudder to think of the risks to America's data and privacy of, let's say we had 1 million Chinese cars on the road, all connected, all collecting data from Americans, all of it going back to Beijing.
Republican lawmakers in turn stressed Secretary Raimondo on labor practices that the Department of Commerce evaluates in order to provide subsidies.
The Biden administration has made no secret of their intent to use the CHIPS Act to benefit labor special interest. The CHIPS Act was first passed as a national security imperative, not a bill to increase the union rolls.
Every lawmaker in Wednesday's hearing at the House Commerce and Energy Committee questioned the secretary on Chinese unfair economic practices. But when it comes to countering Chinese technologies in U.S. markets, the Secretary Raimondo had no set plans. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
A house is swept away by raging waters. Residents in the Midwest continue to face the effects of torrential rains and a scorching heat wave. NTD's Fiona G has more.
Shocking footage shows the moment a house topples into the flood-swollen Blue Earth River below.
Oh my.
Days of severe thunderstorms caused the Blue Earth River in Minnesota to swell dramatically and push against the Rapidan Dam. Officials became aware of accumulating debris at the dam on Sunday. The dam's west abutment failed Monday, sending part of the river around the dam and eroding the bank where the home sat. The Barnes family, who has owned the home for over half a century, had evacuated the house before the collapse. The Rapidan Dam is built on sandstone bedrock, which can continue to erode with severe weather. The National Inventory of Dams classifies the dam as being in poor condition and says it poses a significant hazard potential. Tornado warnings, flash flooding, and large hail persist across the Midwest. At least 2 have died from flood-related incidents in Iowa and South Dakota. Both states recorded record-high river levels. Some regions have been hit with a month's worth of rain in only 48 hours. Some communities have issued evacuation orders, while others are still without power. Fiona G., NTD News.
NASA is weighing its options on how to get the 2 American astronauts back to Earth safely on Boeing's space capsule. The Starliner is still under repair while docked at the International Space Station.
NASA astronauts Barry Wilmore and Sunita Williams arrived at the International Space Station after lifting off on June 5th. It's the 3rd trip for the pair to the ISS on a mission that was only scheduled to last 8 days. The Starliner service capsule, currently docked at the ISS, has had 5 helium leaks. NASA and Boeing engineers are continuing to fix and test the vehicle so that it can return safely to Earth. The space agency scheduled 3 attempts to bring the crew home. An anonymous source at NASA says a tentative return date is set for July 6th. NASA engineers did say the service capsule can be used in an emergency as an escape pod. If the fixes don't work, the options for getting Wilmore and Williams back to Earth include using Crew Dragon. The SpaceX vehicle carried 3 astronauts to the ISS in March. NASA and Boeing engineers say nothing about the current problems would warrant the use of Crew Dragon. That same option was considered the last time a NASA astronaut needed a different ride back to Earth. Frank Rubio was on board a Russian Soyuz spacecraft when it developed a leak on a mission to the ISS in 2022. He eventually returned home using an empty Soyuz capsule that was docked at the space station.
2 days after Title IX turned 52, Riley Gaines, Martina Navratilova, and several former athletes and coaches spoke in opposition to new changes to the law. Many said the amendments are a backward progression from their original intention. NTD's Jason Blair has more from the event.
Title IX was signed into law in 1972. It's intended to eliminate sex-based discrimination in schools that receive federal funds. It applies to a wide range of areas, including sports, admissions, and financial aid. Title IX was recently amended to include gender identity and sexual orientation. These changes go into effect August 1st. On Tuesday evening in Washington, D.C., former NCAA swimmer Paula Scanlon said the new changes are trying to equate sex to gender identity.
Meaning, if you identify as a woman, anyone can identify as a woman, it makes you equivalent to being a female, which is just biologically not true.
She said the changes won't just apply to sports, but also academic scholarships, bathrooms, locker rooms, and female-only dorms.
Imagine sending your 17-year-old off to college and she gets a random roommate and you think it's going to be a female-only dorm, but you show up and her roommate is another 17-year-old boy.
In March, President Joe Biden issued an executive order that tasked the Department of Education with amending Title IX. In the order, it stated, quote, "It is the policy of my administration that all students should be guaranteed an educational environment free from discrimination on the basis of sex, including discrimination in the form of sexual harassment, which encompasses sexual violence, and including discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity." Tennis legend Martina Navratilova said that women's sports and women's spaces must stay sex-based.
We cannot have women's sports not be female.
Riley Gaines, an NCAA swimmer who famously lost a trophy to a transgender competitor after tying at the 2022 National Championships, also spoke on Tuesday.
It's transcended into prisons. We're seeing male inmates who are in prison, incarcerated for heinous crimes, sexual crimes, enter into women's facilities now. We're seeing how this is affecting sororities.
During the tour's previous stop in North Carolina, their bus was egged and vandalized with pro-transgender graffiti.
It was pretty severe. The marks are still on there, but, you know, we didn't care. It just really fired everybody up and just got everyone even more pumped to come to our next few stops.
The Take Back Title IX tour has completed 11 of 13 planned stops. They say their aim is to raise awareness over the Title IX amendments that they say are, quote, stripping sex-based protections in education. Jason Blair, NTD News.
The 2024 NBA draft starts tonight with Atlanta owning the first pick. But in a draft with no consensus top player, who they'll pick remains a mystery. NTD's Dave Martin has more.
Unlike last year, where teams were lining up to select French teenager Victor Wembanyama, the 2024 draft has no obvious superstar at the top. Some pundits, though, have projected it'll be another French teenager, Zachary Rissachet. The 19-year-old is a 6-foot 10-inch wing, known especially for his defense. While foreign-born players will likely make up half of the first 10 picks, the top American college players taken will likely consist of Kentucky's Reed Sheppard, UConn center Donovan Clingan, and Tennessee sharpshooter Dalton Knecht. Meanwhile, reigning NCAA Player of the Year Zach Edey could go somewhere in the mid-teens. But the biggest question mark in the draft will be where and when LeBron James' son Bronny will land. LeBron has long talked about his desire to play with his sons, but Bronny, who was a McDonald's All-American in high school, suffered a cardiac arrest last summer that delayed his freshman year at USC, and he never really got going, placing 8th on his own team in scoring at just under 5 points per game. Elsewhere in the NBA, the Brooklyn Nets reportedly traded forward Mikal Bridges to the New York Knicks for a bevy of future draft picks, according to ESPN. The trade reunites Bridges with now 3 of his former championship-winning Villanova teammates on the New York Knicks. Simultaneously, the Nets also completed a trade with the Houston Rockets, getting back 2 of their own picks they sent to Houston in the 2021 blockbuster James Harden trade. To do so, they gave up a pair of future first-round picks and pick swaps acquired from Phoenix in the Kevin Durant deal, meaning the Rockets will essentially be betting against the Phoenix Suns' success. Houston, though, will still hold on to Brooklyn's number 3 overall pick in this year's draft. This is Dave Martin for NTD News.